Miss Marple and Scandal in the Choir Vestry. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I am Ailey, your host, and it's always a joy to see our community gathered together. Tell me, what makes these mysteries special for you? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you can join us for a new story each day. Now let's start tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Bells over St. Hedwig's Cross. The train from London had been punctual, which Miss Jane Marple always considered a good omen. As she stepped onto the platform at St. Hedwig's Cross, the brisk October air carried with it the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of church bells practicing their changes. Her godson Raymond had insisted she take a taxi from the station, but Miss Marple preferred to walk when visiting a new village. One learned so much more that way. St. Hedwig's Cross proved to be everything a proper English village should be. The high street curved gently between rows of neat cottages, their gardens still showing late roses and Michaelmas daisies. The church tower rose above the copper beeches at the far end, gray stone against an uncertain sky. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and made her way toward the vicarage, her shrewd blue eyes taking in every detail. She had come for the christening of her cousin Lettice's grandchild, though Lettice herself had moved to Bath years ago and would not be attending. The invitation had come from Lettice's daughter-in-law, Mrs. Elenina Brent, whom Miss Marple had never met. It was rather an unusual arrangement, but then modern families often were. The vicarage was a solid Victorian building set back from the road. Miss Marple had barely reached the gate when the front door opened, and a young woman hurried out, nearly colliding with her. "Oh, I do beg your pardon." The woman was perhaps 35, with fair hair hastily pinned and an anxious expression. "You must be Miss Marple." "I'm Elenina Brent. I'm so terribly sorry, but I've just had word that the christening font cover needs collecting from the church. The verger forgot it yesterday, and with the service tomorrow morning and the christening after, I simply must fetch it now." "Please don't distress yourself, my dear," said Miss Marple mildly. "I shall be perfectly content to settle in. Perhaps I might walk over to the church later and admire it. One does so enjoy seeing a fine country church." Mrs. Brent's relief was palpable. "Would you? That would be so kind. Just follow the path through the churchyard. You can't miss it." She glanced at her watch. "The choir will be rehearsing about now. Mr. Hensley is frightfully particular about Saturday practice." Miss Marple was shown to a comfortable guest room overlooking the garden. After refreshing herself, she decided that a walk to the church would indeed be pleasant. The afternoon was drawing in, and she had always found that the hour before evensong had a particular quality of peace about it. The path through the churchyard was well maintained, winding between ancient headstones and yew trees. As Miss Marple approached the church, she could hear voices raised in song. The building itself was Norman, she judged, with later additions. The south door stood open. She entered quietly, not wishing to disturb the rehearsal. The interior was dim and smelled of old stone, beeswax, and the faint mustiness of hymn books. A group of perhaps 15 singers stood in the choir stalls, their voices blending in what Miss Marple recognized as a setting of Psalm 23. At the organ sat a thin young man with nervous hands, his foot working the pedals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Standing before the choir was a tall, gray-haired man of perhaps 60, his back ramrod straight, one hand raised to conduct. This would be Mr. Hensley, the choirmaster Mrs. Brent had mentioned. Miss Marple slipped into a pew near the back and listened. The choir was not professionally accomplished, but they sang with genuine feeling. She found herself observing them with the same attention she might give to the characters in one of her nephew Raymond's detective stories. The soprano section held her interest particularly. One woman, rather handsome, with dark hair elaborately dressed, sang with her eyes fixed on Mr. Hensley with an intensity that seemed excessive for mere musical devotion. Another, younger and fairer, kept glancing sideways at her neighbor as though seeking approval. A third, perhaps 50, sang with her chin lifted and a slight smile, as though she knew something the others did not. Mr. Hensley brought the psalm to a close with a sharp downward gesture. "Better," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Miss Finch, you're still rushing the third verse. Ivy, you must watch my hands, not Mrs. Peaton's face." The fair-haired soprano flushed scarlet. "Yes, Mr. Hensley, I'm sorry. We'll take it again from 'He leadeth me.' And might I remind you all that tomorrow is not merely Sunday, but the Harvest Festival service. The bishop's representative will be present. I expect perfection." A small murmur ran through the choir. Miss Marple, who had spent many years observing the behavior of village choirs, recognized the particular quality of that murmur. It spoke of resentment carefully suppressed. The rehearsal continued. Miss Marple noticed that the young organist seemed uncomfortable whenever Mr. Hensley approached him with corrections. The curate, a pale young man in his 20s, stood at the back of the choir with a prayer book clutched in his hands, though he never once opened it. His eyes, Miss Marple observed, rarely left the dark-haired soprano. It reminded her of something her cook had once said about the baker's boy and the grocer's daughter. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was much the same everywhere. When the rehearsal ended, Mr. Hensley dismissed the choir with barely a word of thanks. As the singers filed out, Miss Marple heard fragments of conversation. "Insufferable man," someone muttered. "Did you see the way he looked at Ivy, as though she'd committed murder?" "Well, after what happened last week?" But the speaker was hushed by her companion, and they passed beyond Miss Marple's hearing. She rose and walked slowly toward the altar, admiring the east window. Behind her she heard footsteps and turned to find Mr. Hensley regarding her with cool appraisal. "May I help you?" His voice was cultured but cold. "I'm Miss Marple, staying at the vicarage for the christening tomorrow. I do hope I haven't intruded on your rehearsal." His expression softened fractionally. "Not at all, though I must say our little choir is hardly worth the attention of a visitor from London." "Oh, but I'm from St. Mary Mead, a village much like this one." "I found your choir most accomplished." Miss Marple paused delicately. "Though I did wonder if there might have been some small difficulty. One develops a sense for these things." Mr. Hensley's face closed like a door. "Difficulties are inevitable when dealing with amateurs. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must lock the choir vestry. Good day." He strode away through a door beside the organ. Miss Marple heard the sound of drawers being opened and closed, then nothing. She waited, but Mr. Hensley did not reappear. After a few moments, Miss Marple made her way back down the nave. At the church door, she nearly collided with a man she had not seen before. He was perhaps 45, wearing a worn jacket and carrying a flat cap. His face was weathered, and his eyes held an expression that Miss Marple recognized. She'd seen it before in St. Mary Mead on the face of a man seeking justice for an old wrong. "Pardon me," he said quietly and stepped aside. Miss Marple walked back to the vicarage through the gathering dusk. The bells had begun their evening practice, and their sound followed her through the churchyard. It was a peaceful sound, but Miss Marple found herself thinking of that half-heard conversation in the church, of Mr. Hensley's cold dismissal, of the fair-haired soprano's frightened eyes, and of the stranger with his haunted expression. She had come to St. Hedwig's Cross for a christening, but she had developed over many years an instinct for trouble, and something in this quiet village church struck her as decidedly wrong. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Visitor. Miss Marple woke at 6:00, as was her habit. The guest room at the vicarage was comfortable, though the pipes made peculiar noises when the heating came on. She dressed carefully, choosing her gray wool suit and her sensible shoes, and descended to the morning room where breakfast had been laid. Mrs. Brent was already there, looking even more harassed than she had the previous day. Her husband, a quiet man who worked in insurance, had already departed for an early train to London. The baby, Miss Marple learned, was sleeping peacefully upstairs under the watchful eye of a capable nurse. "I do hope you slept well," Mrs. Brent said, pouring tea with an unsteady hand. "I'm afraid I barely closed my eyes. So much to think about with the christening this afternoon." "Everything will go beautifully, I'm sure," Miss Marple said. The church looked most welcoming yesterday. They discussed the arrangements over toast and marmalade. The christening was to take place at 2, following the morning service. Miss Marple had just inquired about the vicar when the doorbell rang with sudden violence. Mrs. Brent started so badly that she nearly upset the teapot. Through the window, they could see the verger, a stocky man of 60, standing on the doorstep in a state of obvious agitation. The maid showed him in. His face was flushed, and he was breathing heavily. "Mrs. Brent, I must speak with the vicar at once. There's been an incident at the church. Most distressing." Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was sometimes slow in coming, but it was no less important for the delay. Human nature being what it was, secrets had a way of surfacing eventually. The truth, like murder, would out. She thought of Mrs. Peaton, whose desperate attempt to preserve her reputation had destroyed it forever. Pride, Miss Marple had long ago observed, was often the most dangerous of sins. The bells rang on, calling the faithful to worship, and in the ancient church of St. Hedwig's Cross. The vicar appeared at that moment, already dressed for morning service in his cassock. He was a mild-looking man of 50 with thinning hair and worried eyes. "Good heavens, Griggs. Whatever is the matter?" "It's Mr. Hensley, sir. I found him in the choir vestry when I came to open up." "He's unconscious, sir." "There's blood." Mrs. Brent gave a small cry. The vicar went pale but collected himself admirably. "We must telephone for Dr. Morris at once." "And the police, I suppose?" He turned to his daughter-in-law. "My dear, please stay with Miss Marple. I shall go directly." "If I might be of any assistance," Miss Marple said quietly, rising from her chair, "in cases of shock, an extra pair of steady hands can be useful." The vicar looked at her with gratitude. "That's very kind. Yes, perhaps you'd better come." They walked quickly through the churchyard, the morning mist still clinging to the ground. The verger explained breathlessly as they went. He had arrived at his usual time just before 6 to prepare for the morning service. The south door had been locked as expected, but when he entered through the vestry entrance, he had found the inner door to the choir vestry standing ajar. "Most irregular, sir. I always check that door myself before leaving. It was locked last evening. I'd stake my life on it." Inside the church, the air was cold and still. They passed through a narrow corridor and into the choir vestry, a small room lined with cupboards for the choir robes and a few chairs for changing. Mr. Hensley lay on the floor near the window, one arm flung out, the other clutching something to his chest. Miss Marple, who had seen several bodies in her time, noted that he was breathing, though shallowly. There was indeed blood, but not a great deal of it, coming from a wound on the back of his head. More interesting was what lay beside him, a torn envelope and several sheets of paper scattered as though they had been dropped. The vicar knelt beside Mr. Hensley and felt for his pulse. "He's alive. Thank God. We mustn't move him until the doctor comes." Miss Marple bent down with some difficulty and examined the papers without touching them. They appeared to be a letter written in an old-fashioned hand. She could make out only a few words: "Truth long buried" and "What happened in 1919." "What's he holding?" the verger asked. Miss Marple peered closer. "A hymn book, I believe. Number 237. She straightened up and looked around the room. One of the cupboard doors stood open, revealing the choir robes hanging in neat rows. On the floor near the cupboard lay what appeared to be a torn piece of fabric. The vicar was examining Mr. Hensley with growing concern. "His breathing seems regular enough. What on earth was he doing here at this hour? Perhaps he came early to prepare for the service, the verger suggested, though he sounded doubtful. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The window was latched from the inside. A chair had been knocked over near the door. On the small table by the wall, she noticed a candle burned down to a stub, the wax still soft. Dr. Morris arrived within 10 minutes, a brisk man in his 40s, who examined Mr. Hensley with professional efficiency. Concussion, certainly. He's taken a blow to the head. We'll need to get him to hospital. The wound itself isn't deep, but at his age, one can't be too careful. Will he recover? The vicar asked anxiously. I should think so. Yes, but he'll need rest and observation. I'll arrange for the ambulance. While they waited, Sergeant Matthews from the village police station arrived, a solid, reliable-looking man who took statements with painstaking care. He examined the letter fragments with interest and carefully placed them in an envelope. The vicar tells me you found him like this, Mr. Griggs, he said to the verger. And you're certain the vestry was locked when you left last evening? Absolutely certain, Sergeant. I check every door myself. Mr. Hensley was the last to leave after choir practice. He always locks up after himself. So either Mr. Hensley returned later and let himself in, or someone else had a key. The sergeant made a note. Does anyone else have access to the vestry? The vicar looked uncomfortable. Well, I have a key naturally, and the verger. I believe Mr. Hensley kept his own key as choir master. The curate has one as well. And Mrs. Peaton, our head of the flower committee, asked for one last year so she could arrange the altar early on festival days. That's rather a lot of keys, Sergeant Matthews observed dryly. The ambulance arrived, and Mr. Hensley was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. As they carried him out, his eyes fluttered open for a moment. The vicar bent close. Mr. Hensley, can you hear me? What happened? Mr. Hensley's lips moved. His voice was barely a whisper. Didn't know. Not meant. His eyes closed again. What did he say? The sergeant asked. Something about not knowing, I think, and not meant. The vicar shook his head helplessly. I couldn't make it out properly. After they had gone, Miss Marple remained in the vestry while the vicar and sergeant conferred in low voices. She noticed something they had missed. Beneath the organ bench in the adjacent room, barely visible in the shadows, lay another scrap of paper. She bent to retrieve it, then thought better of touching it. Sergeant Matthews, she called softly. I believe there may be something else here. The sergeant came and extracted the paper with care. It was the corner of an envelope, scorched as though someone had tried to burn it. On it, in the same old-fashioned hand as the letter, were written 3 words, the truth about... The rest had been consumed by fire. The vicar looked stricken. I don't understand any of this. Who would attack Mr. Hensley? And what is this letter about? Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression was thoughtful. She was remembering the stranger she had seen at the church door the previous evening and the fragment of conversation she had overheard. After what happened last week. Something had been happening in St. Hedwig's Cross before this morning's discovery, and she suspected that Mr. Hensley's attack was not the beginning of the story, but somewhere nearer the middle. Chapter 3. Whispers. Among the hymnless. The christening, rather remarkably, proceeded as planned. The vicar had initially suggested postponement, but Mrs. Brent had been on the verge of tears, and her husband, summoned back from London by telephone, had argued that there was no reason to disappoint the family. Mr. Hensley was in hospital, conscious but claiming to remember nothing of the morning's events. The doctor had declared him fortunate. The police had removed the evidence, and the church had been deemed safe for the afternoon service. Miss Marple, observing the vicar's worried face throughout the ceremony, thought that he looked like a man carrying a burden he did not wish to share. The baby, at least, behaved admirably. Afterward, there was tea at the vicarage for the family and a few close friends. Miss Marple found herself seated near the window with a cup of weak tea and a slice of seed cake, perfectly positioned to observe the comings and goings. The village, naturally, was abuzz with speculation. Mrs. Peaton, the handsome, dark-haired woman from the soprano section, arrived bearing a large arrangement of chrysanthemums. She was elegantly dressed in dove gray with pearls at her throat and carried herself with the assurance of someone accustomed to being noticed. "My dear vicar," she said, pressing his hand with what Miss Marple considered excessive warmth. "What a dreadful shock for us all. Poor Mr. Hensley. Has there been any word from the hospital?" "He's resting comfortably, Mrs. Peaton. The doctor expects a full recovery, though he may be some weeks regaining his strength." "Thank heaven for that." She lowered her voice. "Of course, everyone is asking what he was doing there so early. And that letter the sergeant mentioned, most mysterious." The vicar looked pained. "I'm sure there's a perfectly ordinary explanation. Perhaps Mr. Hensley simply arrived early to prepare and had an unfortunate fall in the choir vestry with the door ajar." Mrs. Peaton's tone suggested she found this unlikely. "Well, I suppose we shall know more when he can speak properly. In the meantime, I've taken the liberty of organizing tomorrow's anthem myself. The choir must carry on, after all." Miss Marple sipped her tea and watched Mrs. Peaton move on to console Mrs. Brent. There was something proprietary in the woman's manner, as though Mr. Hensley's misfortune had created an opportunity she was eager to seize. The young organist arrived next, looking nervous and uncertain. His name, Miss Marple learned, was Timothy Haywood, and he was articled to a solicitor in the neighboring town. He spoke briefly to the vicar, then retreated to a corner where he stood clutching a teacup and looking as though he wished to be anywhere else. Miss Finch, the fair-haired soprano, came in with her mother, a formidable woman in black bombazine, who surveyed the gathering with the air of one expecting to find fault. Young Ivy Finch looked as though she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled as she accepted a cup of tea from the maid. Miss Marple maneuvered herself closer to where Ivy stood with her mother. "Such a trying day for everyone," Miss Marple said gently. "You sing in the choir, I believe." "I heard you yesterday during rehearsal." Ivy managed a wan smile. "Yes, though I'm not very good. Mr. Hensley's always correcting me." "Nonsense," her mother said sharply. "Mr. Hensley's far too exacting. Always has been. I've told you before, Ivy. You have a perfectly adequate voice." This faint praise seemed to distress Ivy further. She bit her lip and looked down at her teacup. "It must have been a shock to hear of this morning's incident," Miss Marple continued. Had Mr. Hensley seemed troubled lately? "One does notice these things in a small community." Mrs. Finch drew herself up. "I'm sure I couldn't say. We don't involve ourselves in gossip." Miss Marple. But Ivy, Miss Marple noticed, had gone very pale indeed. The curate appeared at that moment, and Miss Marple observed that his eyes went immediately to Mrs. Peaton, not to Ivy as she had expected. The young man's name was Arthur Blythe, and he was, the vicar had mentioned, newly ordained and finding his feet in parish work. Miss Marple watched as Mr. Blythe crossed the room and engaged Mrs. Peaton in conversation. There was an intensity in his manner that spoke of something more than clerical courtesy. Mrs. Peaton, for her part, seemed amused by his attention, though she kept glancing toward the door as though expecting someone else. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the older woman standing alone near the bookshelf. She was perhaps 55, plainly dressed in brown serge, with gray hair pulled back severely. Her face held an expression of what Miss Marple could only describe as bitter satisfaction. "That's Miss Edna Blythe," whispered a voice at her elbow. Miss Marple turned to find an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a clerical collar. He introduced himself as Canon Prescott, recently retired. The curate's aunt. Keeps house for him. Rather a sad case, I've always thought. Indeed, Miss Marple encouraged. She left the village many years ago under something of a cloud. Came back only last year when her nephew was appointed here. Caused quite a stir, I can tell you. Some of the older parishioners have long memories. How interesting. What sort of cloud? The canon looked uncomfortable. Oh, I shouldn't repeat old gossip. Something about a young man she was engaged to. He disappeared rather suddenly. There were rumors, unpleasant ones, but nothing was ever proved. Edna left shortly after and made her life elsewhere. Must be strange for her being back. Miss Marple studied Miss Blythe with renewed interest. The woman's eyes were fixed on Mrs. Peaton and the young curate with an expression that was difficult to read. Not anger precisely. More like watchfulness. The vicar was speaking now, thanking everyone for their support during this difficult time. He mentioned that Sergeant Matthews would likely wish to speak with various members of the congregation, particularly those who had been at choir practice the previous evening. I trust you will all cooperate fully, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The sergeant assures me this is merely routine. Mr. Hensley will recover, and I'm certain there's a simple explanation for everything. Miss Marple doubted this very much. As the gathering began to disperse, she overheard a fragment of conversation between two elderly women near the door. Of course it's connected to that business last week. Mark my words, the vestry being ransacked, you mean? I heard nothing was taken. That's just it. They were looking for something specific. And now this attack on poor Mr. Hensley. But who would want to hurt him? Unless... The woman lowered her voice to a whisper. Unless it wasn't him they were after at all. The other woman gasped softly, and they moved away before Miss Marple could hear more. Miss Marple remained in the morning room after the last guest had departed, helping Mrs. Brent collect teacups with a gentle efficiency that came from years of village teas. Through the window she could see the church tower rising above the trees, its bells silent now in the fading afternoon light. Three things occupied her thoughts. A letter about events from 1919, a woman who had left the village in disgrace decades ago and recently returned, and Mr. Hensley's whispered words, not meant. Not meant for him, perhaps, but then for whom? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once known a housemaid accused of stealing a bracelet. The true thief had been the lady's companion, who had carefully arranged matters so suspicion fell elsewhere. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, had a tendency to repeat itself. When something appeared to be one thing, it was often wise to consider whether it might be something else entirely. Yet she thought about the stranger she had seen at the church door with his haunted expression and worn jacket. She thought about Ivy Finch's frightened eyes and Mrs. Peaton's proprietary air, and Miss Edna Blythe's bitter face. Somewhere in this quiet village, someone was very afraid of the past, and they had been willing to use violence to keep it buried. Chapter 4. The Letter in the Organ Bench. Miss Marple had always believed that a morning walk was conducive to clear thinking. The following day being Monday, Mrs. Brent was occupied with household matters, and the vicarage was quiet. Miss Marple set out shortly after breakfast, ostensibly to enjoy the autumn air, but in reality to visit the church once more. The morning was crisp and bright, with a touch of frost still lingering in the shadows. As she approached the lich gate, she encountered the verger, Mr. Griggs, who was sweeping leaves from the path. "Good morning, Mr. Griggs. I do hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Miss Marple." "Come to see the church, have you?" "It's open, though the choir vestry is still locked by order of the sergeant." "Not that there's anything to see now. They took away all the evidence yesterday." "Such a distressing incident. You mentioned that Mr. Hensley always locked up after himself. Was he particularly careful about such things?" Mr. Griggs leaned on his broom, grateful for the chance to talk. "Oh, very particular he was. Some might say too particular. Had his own ideas about how things should be done and didn't welcome suggestions. He lowered his voice. Between you and me, Miss Marple, there were those in the choir who found him difficult. Indeed. I did notice a certain tension during Saturday's rehearsal. Tension? The verger gave a short laugh. That's putting it mildly. There was a right-to-do last Tuesday evening. I heard voices raised, something shocking, when I came to check the furnace. Mr. Hensley and young Miss Finch they were. She was crying. He was angry. I didn't catch the words, mind, but it shook me, I can tell you. How very unpleasant. I wonder what it was about. Couldn't say. But Miss Finch left in a terrible state, and Mr. Hensley was in a foul mood for the rest of the week. Snapped at everyone during Thursday's practice. He shook his head. And then there was the business with the vestry being disturbed. Disturbed? The Wednesday before last, I found drawers opened and papers scattered about. Reported it to Mr. Hensley, I did, but he told me not to mention it to anyone. Said it was probably just carelessness on his part. But I know what I saw, Miss Marple. Someone had been searching for something. Miss Marple thanked him and continued into the church. The interior was as peaceful as before, though the memory of Saturday's discovery seemed to linger in the cold air. She made her way slowly up the nave, pausing to examine the memorial tablets on the walls. One caught her attention. In loving memory of Captain James Whitfield, died 1919, age 24, and his beloved father, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, vicar of this parish, died 1920, age 58, reunited in God's grace. There was something about the dates that struck her as significant. She moved on to the organ and sat carefully on the bench. The instrument was old but well maintained. She lifted the seat to examine the storage space beneath, as much out of curiosity as anything else. The compartment held the usual collection of sheet music and spare hymnals. But wedged at the very back, almost out of sight, was a piece of paper that had been folded many times over. Miss Marple extracted it with some difficulty and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, or rather part of one. The paper was yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to brown. The handwriting was the same old-fashioned script she had glimpsed on the papers found beside Mr. Hensley. "My dearest," it began, "the truth must be told at last. I can no longer bear the weight of what happened in 1919. Your father's death was not what they claimed. He knew about the child, about the lies that were told, and he confronted those responsible. They silenced him as they silenced James. Now they seek to silence me. But I will not let the truth be buried with—" The letter ended there, torn roughly where the rest should have been. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind working rapidly. A vicar who died in 1920, shortly after his son, a child presumably born out of wedlock, lies and silencing, and someone, even now, desperate to prevent the truth from emerging. She heard footsteps and quickly folded the letter, slipping it into her handbag. A moment later, young Arthur Blythe appeared from the vestry corridor. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find anyone here." He looked tired and anxious, his clerical collar slightly askew. "I came to collect some prayer books for the almshouses." "What a kind thought." "I was simply admiring the organ." "Such a fine instrument," the curate glanced at it distractedly. "Yes, it's very old, 17th century mostly, though much restored. Mr. Hensley was devoted to it." He paused. "Have you had any word from the hospital? I understand he's improving, though still claiming to remember nothing of the attack." "How convenient," Mr. Blythe said, then flushed. "Forgive me. That was unkind. It's just that this whole business has unsettled everyone terribly. My aunt is quite distraught." "Your aunt being Miss Edna Blythe? I believe I saw her at the vicarage yesterday." "Yes, she's lived with me since I took up this position last year. It's been difficult for her, returning to the village after so long away." He fidgeted with the prayer books. "There are those who remember old scandals and won't let them rest." Scandals have a way of persisting, Miss Marple observed gently, particularly when the truth has never been properly established. The curate gave her a sharp look. What do you mean? Only that where there is mystery, speculation tends to flourish. It's human nature. He seemed about to reply when the sound of raised voices came from outside. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Mrs. Peaton in animated conversation with Timothy Haywood, the young organist. Mrs. Peaton appeared to be scolding him, and Mr. Haywood looked miserable. "Oh dear," the curate murmured. "That's been going on for weeks now. They seem at odds. Mrs. Peaton believes Timothy isn't suitable as organist. She's been trying to persuade the vicar to replace him. Mr. Hensley defended him, which rather surprised everyone. They're usually at loggerheads over church matters. This was interesting." Miss Marple filed it away for future consideration. After the curate departed with his prayer books, Miss Marple remained in the church a while longer. She walked slowly around the interior, noting the excellent condition of the choir stalls, the well-tended brass, the carefully arranged flowers on the altar. Someone, she thought, took great pride in this church. Someone cared deeply about maintaining its dignity and reputation, and someone was willing to commit violence to protect its secrets. She thought about the letter fragment in her handbag. Your father's death was not what they claimed. The memorial tablet had said the vicar died in 1920, the year after his son. Natural causes had been assumed, no doubt. But what if there had been nothing natural about either death? In St. Mary Mead, there had been a case involving an inheritance and a conveniently timed heart attack. The doctor had signed the certificate without question, and it had been years before the truth emerged. Respectable people, Miss Marple knew, could commit terrible acts when sufficiently motivated, and the desire to protect one's reputation, one's family, one's position in society could be a very powerful motivation indeed. She made her way back to the vicarage as the church clock struck 11. Mrs. Brent was in the morning room writing letters and looked up with a smile. Did you enjoy your walk, Miss Marple? Very much, thank you. The church is quite beautiful. I noticed a memorial to a Reverend Whitfield. Was he vicar here long? Oh, I wouldn't know. That was long before our time. My husband's only been here 3 years. She paused, though. I believe someone mentioned that the Whitfields were connected to the Hensley family somehow. Distant relations, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. How interesting is it? I can't think why it would matter now. Mrs. Brent returned to her letters, but Miss Marple noticed her hand was unsteady, and she made several blots on the paper. Everyone in St. Hedwig's Cross, it seemed, was unsettled by recent events, and Miss Marple was beginning to understand why. Chapter 5. A Choir Robe. Out of place. Sergeant Matthews called at the vicarage on Tuesday morning with news from the hospital. Mr. Hensley had been allowed visitors, and the sergeant had spent half an hour attempting to extract information from him. The results, he admitted to the vicar and Miss Marple over coffee in the study, had been frustrating. He claims he remembers nothing after locking up Saturday evening, the sergeant said, stirring his coffee with unnecessary vigor. Says he has no idea why he would have returned to the church early Sunday morning and no recollection of being struck. The doctors say it's possible with a head injury, but it's damned inconvenient. Perhaps his memory will return in time, the vicar suggested hopefully. Perhaps. The sergeant did not sound convinced. What troubles me more is the letter. We've had it examined, and the paper is definitely old, possibly 40 or 50 years. The ink as well. Someone wrote that letter decades ago, and Mr. Hensley was found clutching it. Why? Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly, set down her cup. Have you been able to determine who the letter was written to, Sergeant? No identifying marks, I'm afraid. And the signature was on the portion that was burned. We found traces of ash in the grate of the Choir Vestry fireplace. Someone tried to destroy the letter but didn't finish the job." "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured. "One wonders whether Mr. Hensley interrupted them or whether the burning was his own doing." The sergeant looked at her with respect. "That's precisely what I've been wondering, Miss Marple. If someone else was burning the letter and Hensley interrupted them, that would explain the attack. But if Hensley was burning it himself, why did he stop? And who attacked him?" The vicar shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sergeant, I must ask, do you believe this is connected to the disturbance in the vestry 2 weeks ago, the one Mr. Hensley dismissed as carelessness?" "I think it's very likely. Someone has been searching for something in that church, and I'd wager they found it Saturday evening. The question is, what happened next?" He consulted his notebook. "I've interviewed most of the choir members. All claim they went directly home after Saturday's rehearsal, which ended at 5. Mr. Hensley remained behind to lock up, as was his custom." "Did anyone see him leave?" Miss Marple asked. "The verger saw him at about 6, walking toward the high street. After that, nothing, until he was found Sunday morning." The sergeant frowned. "There is one odd thing, though. When we examined the vestry more carefully, we found a choir robe in the cupboard that shouldn't have been there." The vicar looked puzzled. "I don't understand." "The robe had been freshly laundered, according to Mrs. Griggs, who does the washing. It should have been hanging with the others in the main section. Instead, it was stuffed in the back of a different cupboard behind some old hymnals, and it was torn, with what appears to be bloodstains on the sleeve." Miss Marple sat forward with interest. "Mr. Hensley's blood? We're having it analyzed, but it seems likely, which suggests someone else was in that vestry when Mr. Hensley was attacked. Someone who got blood on their robe and hid it quickly before leaving." "Good heavens," the vicar said faintly. "You mean one of our choir members? Or someone who had access to the choir robes? They're not locked away after all. Anyone could slip one on." The sergeant closed his notebook. "I'll be speaking to the choir members again, more thoroughly this time. In particular, I want to know more about this argument between Mr. Hensley and Miss Finch that the verger mentioned." After the sergeant departed, Miss Marple requested permission to visit the church once more. The vicar, looking harassed, agreed readily enough. He had a funeral to arrange and seemed grateful to have Miss Marple occupied elsewhere. The church was empty when she arrived, though she could hear Mr. Griggs moving about in the crypt below. She made her way to the choir vestry, which had now been unlocked. The room looked ordinary enough in the daylight, but Miss Marple could imagine how sinister it must have seemed when Mr. Griggs discovered Mr. Hensley lying unconscious on the floor. She examined the cupboard where the blood-stained robe had been found. It was tucked away in a corner, an older piece of furniture than the others, with doors that creaked when opened. Inside were stacks of old service books and several moth-eaten hassocks. At the very back she could see the space where the robe must have been concealed. Why hide it there rather than remove it from the church entirely? Unless the person had been disturbed and fled before they could dispose of it properly, or unless they had intended to return later and retrieve it when the fuss had died down. Miss Marple heard footsteps and turned to find Miss Edna Blaythe standing in the doorway. The woman's face was as severe as before, but there was something else in her expression now, fear, perhaps, or resignation. "Miss Marple, I thought I might find you here." "Good morning, Miss Blaythe. I was just admiring the church. Your nephew speaks very warmly of his work here, does he?" Miss Blaythe's tone was bitter. "Arthur is too good for this place, too innocent. He doesn't understand what this village is capable of." "You speak as though you have had some unhappy experience." The older woman was silent for a moment, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I left St. Hedwig's Cross 30 years ago, Miss Marple. I was young then, and foolish enough to believe that love and honesty mattered more than reputation. I learned otherwise. The young man who disappeared. Miss Marple said gently. You were engaged to him, I understand. Miss Blythe's face went rigid. Who told you that? It's a small village, Miss Blythe. People remember, and now you've returned, and old secrets are stirring again. I came back because Arthur needed me. I have kept silent for 3 decades, and I would have continued to do so. But someone else wouldn't let the past rest. Her voice shook slightly. That letter the police found. It speaks of things that should have remained buried. My James knew the truth, and they killed him for it. Now someone else knows, and they're frightened. Frightened enough to attack Mr. Hensley. What truth, Miss Blythe? But the woman shook her head. I've said too much already. I came to warn you, Miss Marple. You seem like an intelligent woman, and intelligence can be dangerous in this place. There are people in St. Hedwig's Cross who will do anything to protect their secrets. Mr. Hensley learned that Sunday morning. You would be wise to remember it. She turned and left before Miss Marple could respond. Miss Marple remained in the vestry, thinking, a young man named James who knew the truth and disappeared 30 years ago. A vicar and his son who died in 1919 and 1920. A letter speaking of a child in lies told to conceal something shameful. And now an attack on Mr. Hensley, who may or may not have been the intended victim. It was like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But Miss Marple had solved puzzles before. In St. Mary Mead, there had been the matter of the 3 spinster sisters and the missing will. Everyone had assumed the will had been destroyed. But Miss Marple had realized it had simply been misfiled among entirely different papers, waiting to be discovered by someone who knew where to look. Perhaps, she thought, the key to this mystery was not in what had happened Sunday morning, but in what had happened decades ago. And perhaps the person who had attacked Mr. Hensley was not trying to create a new secret, but to protect an old one. She made her way slowly back to the vicarage, her mind busy with calculations. The past and present were tangled together like threads in a complicated embroidery. To understand one, she would need to unravel the other, and time, she suspected, was running short. Chapter 6. Scandal from years ago. Monsieur Marple had learned over many years of observation that every village possessed at least one person who knew everything worth knowing about its history. In St. Hedwig's Cross, that person proved to be Colonel Warburton, the village historian, who lived in a rambling house at the far end of the high street. She called upon him Wednesday afternoon, armed with a letter of introduction from the vicar and a plate of Mrs. Brent's shortbread. The colonel, a spry gentleman of 75 with magnificent white whiskers, welcomed her with delight. A fellow enthusiast for local history. How splendid. Do come in, Miss Marple. I've just made a fresh pot of tea. His study was a treasure trove of documents, maps, and photographs, all meticulously organized in filing cabinets and leather-bound albums. The colonel settled Miss Marple in a comfortable chair and poured tea into delicate china cups. Now then, what particular aspect of our village's history interests you? The Norman Church? The Civil War encampment? We have quite a rich past, you know. I'm fascinated by the more recent history, actually, Miss Marple said. The Great War period and just after. I noticed a memorial in the church to Reverend Whitfield and his son. The colonel's cheerful expression faded slightly. Ah, yes, a tragic business that. Both gone within a year of each other. The son was killed in France in 1919, just after the armistice, and the father followed in 1920. Heart failure, the doctor said, brought on by grief. How very sad. Were they well liked in the village? Captain Whitfield was a fine young man by all accounts. Brave, honorable. His father was perhaps more complicated. The colonel selected a leather album from a nearby shelf and opened it. Carefully. Here you can see them both. The photograph showed a stern-looking clergyman, in his 50s, standing beside a handsome young man in uniform. Captain Whitfield had an open, honest face and steady eyes. His father looked formidable. Reverend Whitfield was a man of very strong principles, the colonel continued. Some say too strong. He believed in absolute honesty and could be quite harsh on those he felt had strayed from the path of righteousness. I imagine that caused some difficulty in a small village. Indeed. There was a scandal in 1919 that divided the parish rather badly. A young woman from a respectable family found herself in a delicate condition, as they used to say. The young man involved was James Hardwick, a farm laborer. He claimed they were engaged and wished to marry her, but the girl's family refused to hear of it. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. James Hardwick, would that be the young man who was engaged to Miss Edna Blythe? The colonel looked surprised. You've heard about that? Yes, the same. Edna was beside herself when James disappeared. She insisted he would never have abandoned her, but everyone assumed he'd run off to avoid the shame. The girl married someone more suitable. The baby was quietly adopted and the matter was hushed up. Or so everyone thought. But Reverend Whitfield didn't let it rest. No, he didn't. He'd been fond of young Hardwick, you see, taught him to read and write, encouraged him to better himself. When James vanished, the Reverend made inquiries. Uncomfortable inquiries. The colonel paused to refill their teacups. There were rumors he'd discovered something troubling. And then he died quite suddenly, before he could reveal whatever he'd learned. How convenient for someone, Miss Marple observed quietly. My thoughts exactly, though I've never said so publicly. The doctor signed the death certificate without hesitation. Heart failure was common enough, and the Reverend had been under terrible strain. But I've always wondered, he closed the album thoughtfully. The Hensley family was deeply involved in the affair. You know, Mr. Hensley's father was the magistrate at the time. He was the one who arranged for the girl to be sent away to have her baby in secret. He also spread the story that James Hardwick had accepted money to disappear. Many believed him. The Hensleys were very influential. Miss Marple considered this. And the young woman, what became of her? She married within 6 months. Fellow named Peaton. I believe he'd been courting her before the unfortunate business with Hardwick. The colonel's eyes twinkled. You may have met his widow. She sings in the choir. Miss Marple felt several pieces of the puzzle click into place. Mrs. Peaton was the girl in question. The very same. She was Dorothy Chambers then, daughter of the local squire. Quite a beauty, and very aware of her position in village society. The Peatons moved away after the marriage, but they returned about 10 years ago when Mr. Peaton inherited property here. He died 5 years back, and Dorothy has lived here ever since, very much the grand lady of the parish, and the child adopted by a family in Yorkshire. I understand whether Mrs. Peaton has maintained any contact. I couldn't say. It's not the sort of thing one discusses in polite society. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, thinking of Mrs. Peaton's proprietary manner, her elegant clothes, her position in the choir, a woman who had once made a terrible mistake and spent the rest of her life burying it beneath respectability. Colonel, you mentioned that James Hardwick disappeared. Was his body ever found? Never. Some said he'd gone to London, others that he'd immigrated. But Edna Blythe always maintained he'd been murdered. She left the village not long after, couldn't bear to stay. When she returned last year with her nephew, it caused quite a stir, I can tell you. I can imagine. Tell me, do you know if anyone kept records of these events? Letters, perhaps, or diaries? The Reverend kept meticulous records of parish business. They should be in the church archives, though I understand Mr. Hensley controlled access to them rather jealously. Said he was organizing them for a parish history, but I suspect he simply didn't want anyone digging into matters best forgotten. Miss Marple thanked the colonel warmly and departed with much to think about. The walk back to the vicarage took her past the church, and she paused at the lych gate to gaze at the ancient building. A young woman's shame concealed by her family. A young man who disappeared rather than abandon her. A clergyman who asked too many questions and died conveniently. And decades later, a letter resurfaces, speaking of truth and lies, causing panic among those who thought the past was safely buried. She thought of the blood-stained choir robe hidden in the cupboard. Someone had worn it on Sunday morning, someone who had been in the vestry when Mr. Hensley was attacked. But who? And had they meant to harm Mr. Hensley? Or had he simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? In St. Mary Mead, there had been a case involving a disputed inheritance. The guilty party had gone to great lengths to destroy evidence, but had overlooked one crucial detail. Human nature, people acted according to their characters, and character, Miss Marple had learned, was remarkably consistent. Mrs. Peaton valued respectability above all else. Miss Edna sought justice for her lost love. Mr. Hensley protected his family's reputation. Each had a motive for wanting the past to remain hidden, or for wanting it revealed. But which of them had been desperate enough to commit violence? Miss Marple continued on to the vicarage, her mind working steadily. She was beginning to see the shape of the truth, though several crucial pieces were still missing. Most importantly, she needed to know what had happened to James Hardwick all those years ago, because she was increasingly certain that his fate held the key to everything that had occurred in the choir vestry at dawn on Sunday morning. Chapter 7, The Soloists. Confession Thursday morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the churchyard paths to mud and kept most sensible people indoors. Miss Marple, however, had never allowed weather to deter her from useful observation. She borrowed an umbrella from the vicarage hall stand and set out for the church, where choir practice was scheduled for the evening. She arrived to find the building empty, save for Timothy Haywood, the young organist, who was practicing scales with more determination than skill. He started violently when he noticed her in the shadows near the font. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. I'm sorry to have startled you. Mr. Haywood, please don't let me interrupt your practice." But the young man had already closed the organ stops and was gathering his music with nervous hands. "I was just finishing, actually. Mrs. Peaton will be here soon to rehearse her solo for Sunday, and she prefers to work without an audience." "She's taking over Mr. Hensley's duties, then?" "Temporarily, yes. Though between you and me, I think she hopes to make it permanent." He lowered his voice, though they were quite alone. "She's never forgiven Mr. Hensley for supporting me as organist. She wanted her nephew appointed to the position. You see, but the vicar preferred someone local." "That must have been awkward." "Quite. Mrs. Peaton can be rather formidable when crossed." He hesitated, then added, "I probably shouldn't say this, but I was glad when Mr. Hensley stood up to her. He wasn't always easy to work with, but he was fair about that at least." Miss Marple filed this away with interest. "He must have been here until quite late on Saturday evening, practicing for Sunday's service. I left before the choir rehearsal ended, actually, about 5. I had to get back to my lodgings to change before meeting friends in the neighboring village." He flushed slightly. "The sergeant has already verified it, if that's what you're wondering." "Not at all, my dear boy. I was merely making conversation." After he departed, looking relieved, Miss Marple settled herself in a pew to wait. She had learned that patience was often rewarded with information, and she suspected that the afternoon might prove instructive. Mrs. Peaton arrived shortly thereafter, sweeping in with her usual air of proprietorship. She wore a burgundy dress that set off her dark hair admirably and carried a leather music case. She seemed surprised to find Miss Marple present. "Good afternoon. I didn't expect to find anyone here. Have you seen Mr. Haywood? He was meant to accompany me. I'm afraid he had to leave. But please don't let my presence disturb you. I was simply enjoying the quiet atmosphere." Mrs. Peaton looked displeased but carried her music to the organ. I suppose I can practice without accompaniment, though it's most inconvenient. That boy is thoroughly unreliable. She began to sing, her voice rising clear and strong in the empty church. Miss Marple listened with genuine appreciation. Whatever else might be said about Mrs. Peaton, she sang beautifully. She had just finished when the church door opened again, and Ivy Finch entered, followed by her mother. Both carried bundles of what appeared to be freshly laundered choir robes. "Oh," said Ivy, stopping short when she saw Mrs. Peaton. "I'm sorry. We didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Mrs. Peaton said coolly. "I was just leaving, though I'm surprised to see you here, Ivy. I understood you'd withdrawn from the choir." Ivy's face went scarlet. "I never said I was withdrawing. I was simply upset, and I missed Tuesday's practice. But Mother thought I should bring the clean robes anyway, and I wanted to speak to the vicar about Sunday's anthem." "How conscientious of you." Mrs. Peaton's tone suggested otherwise. "Though given recent events, I would have thought you'd prefer to avoid the church for a while." Mrs. Finch drew herself up. "I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Peaton, but my daughter has nothing to be ashamed of." "I implied nothing, though we all know that Mr. Hensley was particularly harsh with Ivy during recent rehearsals. The entire choir heard him rebuke her on multiple occasions." "That's not fair," Ivy said, her voice shaking. "He was angry with everyone, not just me. And after what he said, after what he accused me of, anyone would have been upset." "What did he accuse you of?" Miss Marple asked gently. Ivy looked at her mother, who gave a tight nod. "He said I'd been asking questions about things that were none of my concern, that I should leave well enough alone, or I'd regret it. But I was only trying to understand." "Understand what, dear?" "About the letter." Ivy's eyes filled with tears. "I found it, you see, 2 weeks ago, when I came early to practice. It was in the organ bench tucked behind some music. I didn't know what it was at first, but when I read it, I realized it was about something that happened long ago. Something involving a girl and a baby and terrible lies." Mrs. Peaton had gone very pale. "You found the letter?" "I didn't know what to do with it. I took it home and showed it to Mother. She said I should give it to the vicar, but I was frightened. The letter mentioned the Hensley family, and I thought Mr. Hensley might be angry if he knew I'd found it. So I put it back where I'd found it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the poor girl and what happened to her." "And you asked Mr. Hensley about it?" Miss Marple prompted. "Yes. After last Tuesday's practice, I asked him if he knew anything about a scandal in 1919. I didn't say I'd found the letter, I just asked general questions. But he became furious. He said I was meddling in matters that could destroy reputations, that the past was best left buried. He said if I spoke of it to anyone, I'd regret it." Ivy wiped her eyes. "I was so frightened. And then on Sunday, when they found him in the Choir Vestry with the letter, I thought perhaps someone else had been looking for it. Someone who wanted to destroy it before the truth came out." Mrs. Finch put a protective arm around her daughter. "Ivy has done nothing wrong. She's a good girl who was simply curious about the past. If Mr. Hensley frightened her with his threats, that's his fault, not hers." "No one is suggesting otherwise," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But Ivy, did you notice if the letter was complete when you found it? Or had parts already been torn away?" Ivy thought carefully. It seemed complete, though the edges were quite worn. There were several pages, all in the same old-fashioned handwriting. But when I replaced it, I may not have put all the pages back together properly. I was in a hurry because I heard someone coming." "And you've told all this to Sergeant Matthews?" "Not yet. I was too frightened. But Mother says I must, so I'm going to the police station this afternoon." Ivy looked at Mrs. Peaton with sudden defiance. "And I don't care what anyone thinks. The letter spoke about justice and truth, and I believe those things matter even..." If they happened a long time ago, Mrs. Peaton's composure cracked for just a moment, and Miss Marple saw naked fear in her eyes. Then the mask returned, and she gathered her music with shaking hands. "How very noble of you, Ivy. I'm sure we all admire your devotion to truth." She swept toward the door, then paused. "Though you might consider that some truths hurt innocent people, that revealing the past can destroy lives in the present. But then you're young. You haven't learned yet that righteousness and wisdom are not always the same thing." She left, and the church seemed suddenly darker despite the afternoon light filtering through the windows. Mrs. Finch hustled her daughter away shortly after, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She sat quietly for some time, piecing together what she had learned. Ivy had found the letter and returned it, but not before Mr. Hensley discovered that someone had been reading it. That explained his anger and his threats. But who had taken the letter from the organ bench a second time? Who had been burning it in the vestry when Mr. Hensley interrupted them? And most importantly, who had been desperate enough to strike him down to prevent the truth from emerging? Miss Marple rose stiffly and made her way back to the vicarage through the rain. The puzzle was becoming clearer, but the most crucial piece was still missing. She needed to know what had really happened to James Hardwick in 1919. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Bell Tower. Friday dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that rattled the vicarage windows. Miss Marple had spent a restless night considering the various threads of the mystery and had reached a conclusion that required verification. After breakfast, she announced her intention to visit the church once more. Mrs. Brent looked concerned. "Are you quite sure, Miss Marple? The weather is rather bitter, and you've been walking about so much this week. I do hope you're not overdoing things." "Fresh air is most beneficial," Miss Marple assured her, "and I've always wanted to see the view from a church tower." The vicar mentioned that the bell tower at St. Hedwig's is accessible to visitors. "Oh, but the stairs are quite steep and rather unsafe. Perhaps I should ask the verger to accompany you." "That won't be necessary, my dear. I'm more capable than I look." The church was empty when she arrived, though she could hear Mr. Griggs working somewhere in the crypt. She made her way to the small door at the base of the tower, which stood unlocked. The stone steps spiraled upward into darkness, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Miss Marple climbed slowly, pausing occasionally to catch her breath and to observe. The tower was clearly used for storage as well as housing the bells. On various landings, she found stacks of old prayer books, moth-eaten kneelers, and dusty boxes of parish records. It was these records that had drawn her here. If the colonel was correct, Reverend Whitfield had kept meticulous notes of parish business, and somewhere in these boxes might be evidence of what he had discovered before his death. On the third landing, she found what she was looking for, a wooden box labeled Parish Records 1915 to 1920 in faded ink. She opened it carefully and began to examine the contents. There were account books, correspondence, and several leather-bound ledgers recording births, marriages, and deaths. One ledger in particular caught her attention. It was a record of church repairs and maintenance, with entries in Reverend Whitfield's distinctive handwriting. She turned the pages carefully, noting the careful accounting of every expense, every decision, and then she found it, a page that had been torn out, leaving only a ragged edge. The entry before the missing page was dated March 1919 and concerned repairs to the vestry floor. The entry after the gap was dated July 1919 and dealt with the replacement of several pews. Whatever had been recorded between March and July had been deliberately removed. Miss Marple sat back on her heels, thinking, what sort of church business would someone need to conceal? And who would have had access to these records? She heard footsteps on the stairs below and quickly replaced the ledger in its box. A moment later, Miss Edna Blythe appeared on the landing, breathing heavily from the climb. "I saw you enter the tower," she said without preamble. "I knew what you were looking for. Did you? The records? The proof of what they did to my James?" Miss Blythe's face was drawn and pale in the dim light. "I've searched these boxes myself, years ago, before I left the village. But anything that might have provided evidence was already gone. They were thorough, I'll give them that. They, being the Hensleys, the Chamberses, all the respectable families who wanted to protect their reputations. Dorothy Chambers most of all. The bitterness in her voice was corrosive. She couldn't bear the thought of marrying beneath her, of being connected to a farm laborer's child. So when James insisted they do the right thing, when he refused to be paid off and disappear, they made certain he disappeared anyway. Miss Marple rose carefully from her cramped position. "You believe James Hardwick was murdered?" "I know he was. Reverend Whitfield knew it too. That's why they killed him as well, though they made it look natural enough." Miss Edna moved to the narrow window and gazed out over the churchyard. "James came to me the night before he vanished. He said he'd confronted Dorothy's father and the magistrate, told them he wouldn't abandon his child. They threatened him, said terrible things. But James wasn't frightened. He was an honest man, Miss Marple. Honest and brave. What happened then? He went to meet them the next morning at the old granary to discuss terms for the marriage. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. When he didn't return, I went to the authorities, but they said he'd simply run off. They found his things missing from his lodgings. They said money gone from his savings. All arranged, of course, to make it look as though he'd left of his own accord. And Reverend Whitfield investigated. He did more than investigate. He discovered where James had really gone." Miss Edna turned back to face her, and there were tears on her weathered cheeks. The vestry floor was being repaired that spring. New stone flags were being laid. The Reverend kept careful records of all such work, including the dates when different sections were completed, and he noticed something curious. Extra materials were ordered and the work took longer than expected. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold tower. James Hardwick was buried beneath the vestry floor. That's what the Reverend believed. He wrote it all down, every piece of evidence, every suspicion. He intended to take it to the authorities in London, where the Hensleys had no influence. But before he could, he died quite suddenly. Quite conveniently. The missing page from the ledger would have shown the exact dates of the vestry work and the extra materials ordered, but it was torn out after his death along with any other documents that might have provided proof. The letter I wrote to Dorothy years later demanding justice was ignored. I had no evidence, only suspicion and grief, so I left. But you kept the letter you wrote to Dorothy, or rather, you kept a copy. Miss Edna's eyes widened. How did you know? Because a letter recently surfaced that speaks of these events. A letter written in an old-fashioned hand, speaking of truth buried and lies told. I suspect it was your letter, Miss Edna. But if you left the village and never returned until last year, how did it come to be hidden in the church? I don't know, unless... She paused, her face stricken. Unless Dorothy kept it all these years, as evidence against me, perhaps. Should I ever try to accuse her publicly? She would have wanted insurance, something to show I was an unhinged woman making wild accusations. And if she kept it in the church among papers she controlled, it would be safe from prying eyes. But someone found it recently and recognized its significance. Arthur, Miss Edna said the name with sudden certainty. My nephew was organizing the parish archives last month. The vicar asked him to create an inventory. He must have found the letter and realized what it meant. Miss Marple considered this. The curate had seemed nervous and preoccupied. If he had discovered evidence that members of his parish, including the choir master, were connected to a decades-old murder, that would certainly explain his distress. Did your nephew know about James Hardwick? I told him some of it when I came to live with him. Not everything, but enough. He is a good boy, Miss Marple, too good. If he found that letter, he would have felt obligated to pursue the truth, regardless of the consequences. They descended the tower stairs in silence, each absorbed in thought. At the bottom, Miss Edna paused. Whatever happens, Miss Marple, I want you to know I didn't attack Mr. Hensley. I've hated that family for 30 years, but I'm not a violent woman. I wanted justice, not revenge. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. But someone else wanted something rather different. They wanted silence. After Miss Edna departed, Miss Marple remained in the church, her mind working steadily through the evidence. A letter discovered and hidden again. A vestry floor that might conceal a terrible secret. An attack meant to prevent truth from emerging. But whose truth and whose silence? She thought of the blood-stained choir robe hastily hidden, of Mr. Hensley's whispered words, not meant, of the fear she had seen in various faces throughout the week. The answer was there, just beyond her grasp, and she suspected that time was running out to prevent further violence. Chapter 9. A Face in the Morning. Fog. Saturday morning arrived, shrouded in mist, the kind of thick autumn fog that turned familiar landscapes strange and muffled all sound. Miss Marple rose early, as had become her habit, and stood at her window, watching the gray world take shape beyond the glass. She had spent much of the previous evening in quiet conversation with the vicar, who'd grown increasingly troubled as the week progressed. Sergeant Matthews had interviewed the choir members again, and tensions were running high. The morning service would be particularly difficult. He feared, with Mr. Hensley still in hospital and suspicion hanging over the congregation like a pall. Miss Marple dressed warmly and slipped out of the vicarage before breakfast. She had decided that a walk in the churchyard might prove beneficial. In her experience, early morning was when guilty consciences drove people to unwise actions, and she suspected that this morning might be no exception. The fog wrapped around her like damp wool as she made her way along the path. Visibility was no more than a few yards, and the church tower appeared and disappeared like a ghost ship in the mist. She could hear the drip of water from the trees, and the distant call of a crow, but otherwise the morning was eerily silent. She had just reached the lich gate when she saw a figure moving through the fog ahead of her. A man walking with purpose toward the edge of the churchyard, where the oldest graves lay forgotten beneath ivy and brambles. Miss Marple recognized his gait and the set of his shoulders. It was the stranger she had encountered at the church door a week ago, the man with the haunted expression and worn jacket. Moving as quietly as her elderly bones allowed, Miss Marple followed him. He stopped at the far wall of the churchyard where ancient headstones leaned at drunken angles and the fog was thickest. Miss Marple positioned herself behind a substantial yew tree and watched as he knelt beside one of the graves, pulling away the weeds that obscured its surface. After a few moments, he spoke, and though his voice was quiet, it carried clearly in the still air. I found it, Dad. The letter, the proof. I know what they did to you now. Miss Marple felt her heartbeat quicken. This, then, was James Hardwick's son, the man continued, his voice rough with emotion. Edna was right all along. They murdered you rather than let you marry above your station. And that vicar who tried to help, they killed him too. All to protect their precious reputations. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was steel in his voice. But I'm going to make them answer for it. I'm going to make certain everyone knows what they did. I think, said Miss Marple, stepping out from behind the yew tree, that you should be very careful about what you do next. Young man. He spun around, his hand going to his pocket in a defensive gesture. In the fog, his face was pale and strained. Who are you? My name is Jane Marple, and you, I believe, are James Hardwick's son. He stared at her for a long moment, then seemed to sag. John Hardwick. I've been searching for the truth about my father's disappearance for 15 years. My mother told me stories before she died, but she had no proof, only what Edna Blythe had told her. I finally found that proof 3 weeks ago, the letter in the church. Yes. I've been coming to St. Hedwig's Cross for months, trying to find evidence. I broke into the church archives, searched through old records, and then I found letters that Edna had written years ago, hidden among other papers. One of them laid out everything she suspected about my father's murder and the conspiracy to conceal it. He looked down at the grave. This is where they buried him, isn't it? Under a false name in unconsecrated ground, like a criminal. Miss Marple moved closer and read the weathered inscription. Here lies William Turner. Died March 1919, age 28, she calculated quickly. James Hardwick would have been about that age. I've been trying to find someone in authority who would listen, John continued bitterly. But the Hensleys are still influential, still respected. When I confronted the choir master last Saturday evening, he laughed at me. Said I had no proof, that the letter was just the ravings of a bitter woman. We argued, and I told him I'd make certain the truth came out, even if I had to dig up this grave myself to prove my father was murdered. And what happened then? He told me to meet him at the church early Sunday morning. Said he had documents that would prove his family had nothing to do with my father's death. I was desperate enough to believe him. John's face twisted. When I arrived at dawn, the vestry door was ajar. I went in and found him on the floor unconscious. The letter was scattered around him. Some of it burned. I panicked and ran. I thought he'd set a trap for me, that someone would claim I'd attacked him. But you hadn't. No, I swear to you, I found him like that. Someone else had been there before me, someone who tried to destroy the letter and attacked Hensley when he interrupted them. He looked at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. You have to believe me. I've been hiding all week, trying to decide what to do. I want justice for my father, but not at the cost of being accused of a crime I didn't commit. Miss Marple studied his face carefully. She had learned over many years to recognize truth when she heard it, and this young man was telling the truth, or at least the truth as he understood it. Mr. Hardwick, I believe you. But you must go to Sergeant Matthews immediately and tell him everything you've told me. Running away only makes you look guilty. And what about my father? What about the justice he deserves? Justice, Miss Marple said firmly, requires more than righteous anger. It requires proof properly presented, and I believe I know how to obtain it. But first you must trust me and do as I say. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. What do you want me to do? Come with me to the vicarage. We'll telephone the sergeant together, and you'll make a full statement. Then this afternoon I intend to gather everyone involved in this matter and reveal the truth. All of it. You know who attacked Hensley? I believe I do. Yes, though proving it may require a certain amount of careful maneuvering. Miss Marple began walking back toward the path, and John fell into step beside her. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual when you found Mr. Hensley? Anything at all that struck you as strange? John thought for a moment. There was a smell like incense or perfume, strong and sweet. And I heard footsteps running away as I approached, but I couldn't see anyone in the fog. Miss Marple nodded to herself. The final piece had fallen into place. They emerged from the fog into the relative clarity of the vicarage garden. The house looked warm and welcoming, its windows glowing with lamplight. But Miss Marple knew that before this day ended, several lives would be changed forever. Justice, she had always believed, was worth any amount of temporary discomfort, and James Hardwick, dead these 30 years, deserved to have his story told at last. Chapter 10. The Truth Behind the Curtain. By 3 that afternoon, the vicarage drawing room was filled with the most unusual assembly. Sergeant Matthews sat near the window, his notebook open on his knee. The vicar occupied his customary chair by the fireplace, looking deeply unhappy. Mrs. Peaton sat with rigid dignity on the sofa, her face a careful mask. Miss Edna Blythe and her nephew, the curate, stood together near the door, while Ivy Finch and her mother occupied 2 chairs brought in from the dining room. Timothy Haywood hovered uncertainly by the bookshelf, and Mr. Griggs, the verger, had been summoned from his duties to attend. John Hardwick stood at the back of the room, his presence causing considerable consternation among those who had not yet been informed of his identity. Miss Marple sat in a straight-backed chair that allowed her to observe everyone present. She had spent the past few hours preparing for this moment, and now, with everyone assembled, she felt the familiar clarity that came when a puzzle was finally ready to be solved. "I expect you're all wondering why I've asked you here," she began quietly. The room fell silent. "The attack on Mr. Hensley last Sunday morning has troubled this village greatly. But I believe the time has come to understand not just what happened that morning, but why it happened. And for that, we must travel back 30 years to 1919. Mrs. Peaton stirred. "I don't see what ancient history has to do with Mr. Hensley's unfortunate accident. It was no accident, Mrs. Peaton, as I think you know very well." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "In 1919, you were Dorothy Chambers, a young woman of good family who found herself in a delicate situation. The father of your child was James Hardwick, a farm laborer. You were engaged to him, or so he believed." "This is outrageous," Mrs. Peaton said, rising from her seat. "I won't sit here and be insulted." "Please sit down, Mrs. Peaton," Sergeant Matthews spoke for the first time. "I think we all need to hear what Miss Marple has to say." Mrs. Peaton subsided, her face white with fury. Miss Marple continued. "James Hardwick refused to abandon you and his unborn child. He insisted on marriage despite your family's objections. But your father and his friend, the magistrate, Mr. Hensley, had other plans. They arranged for you to be sent away to have the baby in secret, and they attempted to bribe James to disappear. When he refused, they took more permanent measures." John Hardwick's hands clenched at his sides, but he remained silent. "James was murdered," Miss Marple said calmly, "and his body was buried beneath the vestry floor during the renovations that spring. Reverend Whitfield discovered the truth, or enough of it to be dangerous. He kept meticulous records, and he noticed irregularities in the vestry work that suggested something was being concealed. Before he could act on his suspicions, he too died, conveniently, quietly. 'A weak heart?' they said." The vicar made a sound of distress. "Surely you're not suggesting that murder was committed in this church?" "I'm afraid I am. 2 murders, in fact, both carefully concealed. The evidence was destroyed, the records altered, and James Hardwick became simply another young man who had run away from his responsibilities. Only Miss Edna Blythe, who loved him, refused to believe the lie. She left the village, but she never forgot. She wrote letters demanding justice, letters that were ignored, but not destroyed." Miss Edna was crying silently now, and her nephew put a protective arm around her shoulders. "Those letters remained hidden for decades," Miss Marple went on, "until last month when Arthur Blythe was cataloging the church archives and found them. He recognized their significance, but being a young man of conscience, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't prove anything, and the accusations were against respected families. So he replaced the letters where he'd found them and tried to decide on the right course of action." The curate nodded miserably. "I should have gone to the police immediately. I was a coward." "You were thoughtful," Miss Marple corrected gently. But others were less patient. Young Ivy Finch also found the letters and read them. She began asking questions, innocent questions, but enough to alarm certain people. Then John Hardwick arrived in the village searching for the truth about his father. He too found the letters and confronted Mr. Hensley. "Who laughed at me?" John said bitterly. Yes, because Mr. Hensley genuinely believed his father had done nothing wrong. The Hensley family had convinced themselves over the years that James Hardwick had been paid off and left voluntarily. They didn't know about the murder. The magistrate had kept that secret even from his own son. Mrs. Peaton's composure cracked slightly. "You can't prove any of this. Perhaps not all of it. But I can prove what happened last Sunday morning." Miss Marple turned to address the room at large. Someone took the letters from their hiding place on Saturday evening after choir practice. That person intended to destroy them completely, to burn them so thoroughly that no evidence remained. They entered the church early Sunday morning and began burning the letters in the Choir Vestry fireplace. But Mr. Hensley interrupted them. "No, that's what we are meant to think," Sergeant Matthews said. But Mr. Hensley's whispered words were, "Didn't know and not meant." Not meant for him, I believe. Because Mr. Hensley wasn't the person who was supposed to be in the vestry that morning. Someone else was expected, someone who had been lured there by a message. And when that person didn't arrive, Mr. Hensley came instead, curious about the smoke from the fireplace that the verger had reported seeing at dawn. Miss Marple looked directly at Mrs. Peaton. "You were burning the letters, weren't you? You'd kept them all these years as insurance, hidden among church papers you controlled as head of the flower committee. But when you learned that others had read them, you panicked. You took the letters on Saturday evening and returned early Sunday morning to destroy them. But you were interrupted, not by Mr. Hensley as you'd expected, but by someone else, someone you struck in panic, someone who fell and hit his head." Mrs. Peaton's face had gone gray. "You have no proof." "I have the choir robe you wore to conceal your clothes, blood-stained and hidden hastily when you fled. I have the perfume you wear and expensive French scent that John Hardwick smelled when he found Mr. Hensley. And I have your motive, a lifetime of secrets that would have been destroyed if the truth emerged. Mr. Hensley would have recovered and identified you," the sergeant said slowly, "except he never saw his attacker. You struck him from behind and fled before he could turn around. I never meant to hurt him." The words burst from Mrs. Peaton like a dam breaking. "I only wanted to protect my reputation, my life. I've spent 30 years burying the past, being respectable, being admired. I couldn't let some old letters destroy everything. Even though an innocent man had been murdered?" Miss Edna's voice shook with rage. "Even though my James deserved justice? Your James was a farm laborer with ideas above his station. My father and the magistrate did what they thought best. I didn't know about the murder, not until I read those wretched letters. But what good would it have done to expose it now? Everyone involved is dead except me." "Not everyone," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your child, given up for adoption all those years ago, is still alive. And that child deserves to know the truth about his father, that James Hardwick was an honest, honorable man who refused to abandon his responsibilities, that he was murdered for doing the right thing." Mrs. Peaton buried her face in her hands and wept. The sergeant moved to stand beside her. "Mrs. Dorothy Peaton, I'm arresting you for the assault on Mr. Hensley. As for the other matters, there will need to be a full investigation." After Mrs. Peaton had been led away, the others began to disperse in subdued silence. John Hardwick approached Miss Marple, his eyes bright with tears. "Thank you. I know it doesn't bring him back, but at least now people will know he wasn't a coward who ran away." "Your father was a brave man," Miss Marple said warmly. "And I suspect he would be very proud of you." Later, as evening fell over St. Hedwig's Cross, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the church tower emerge from the shadows. The bells were ringing for evensong, clear and true in the still air. The vicar had decided that the vestry floor would be excavated carefully and respectfully to recover James Hardwicke's remains and give him a proper burial. Miss Edna would finally have closure, and John would have a grave to visit.